Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. So today in this video we are going to talk about thyroid gland, but we will mainly focus on the synthesis of thyroid hormones. So before we discuss in detail about the synthesis of thyroid hormones, let us have a look on the very basic structure of the thyroid gland. So thyroid gland is actually a gland which is present in our neck, inferior to our larynx. Okay, and it is present anteriorly to our trachea. So this thyroid gland actually has two lateral lobes, and those two lateral lobes are left lateral lobe. Here is left lobe, and here we have the right lobe. Fine. Now this left lobe and right lobe, they are connected to each other by this structure here, which is called isthmus. Okay. Now this thyroid gland, it contains thyroid follicles. Now thyroid follicles are actually the structural and functional units of our thyroid gland. Okay, you can see here these circular structures, these are actually called as thyroid follicles. Thyroid follicles. And these thyroid follicles are made up of these glandular cells, which are actually simple cuboidal cells, or can be simple squamous cells as well. And these cells are called as follicular cells. So they are called as follicular cells. Okay, now in between these thyroid follicles, there is another type of cell which is present there in the thyroid gland. You can see here, these cells are called as parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells we are not going to discuss in detail today, and these parafollicular cells are actually involved in the synthesis of a hormone called as calcitonin. That calcitonin is playing its role in the regulation of calcium in our body. So we will mainly focus on these thyroid follicles and the follicular cells. Right. Now this synthesis of the thyroid hormones, that is T3 and T4, we are going to discuss about. T3 and T4 synthesis, that process actually starts from our hypothalamus. We have now discussed this so many times. This hypothalamus is actually, it contains various nuclei, and one of the nucleus is our paraventricular nucleus. So here is our paraventricular nucleus. Now this paraventricular nucleus, it actually secretes a hormone, and that hormone is called as thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. That is thyrotropin releasing hormone. And this thyrotropin releasing hormone, secreted by the paraventricular nucleus of hypothalamus, it goes through the hypophyseal portal system, and it goes and stimulates a cell there in the anterior pituitary, and that cell is called as the thyrotropin. It is called as thyrotropin. And when this thyrotropin releasing hormone, it goes and stimulates this thyrotropin, this thyrotropin secretes a hormone, and that hormone is called as thyroid stimulating hormone. Fine. Now thyroid stimulating hormone, it goes and acts on our thyroid gland, and actually the follicular cell of the thyroid follicle. Okay, now here are the follicular cells. I have just opened up a thyroid follicle. Now here are the simple cuboidal cells I have made here, are the follicular cells of the thyroid follicle. And here this area is actually the lumen of that thyroid follicle. When we see here, we see these These are the follicular cells, and in between there is this circle here that is actually the lumen of the thyroid follicle, and that lumen is this area right here. Now what this thyroid stimulating hormone will do is it will go through the circulation and it will act on this thyroid follicular cell. Now here is the hormone, this thyroid stimulating hormone, and this thyroid stimulating hormone will act on this receptor. It will bind on this receptor, and this receptor is specially for the thyroid stimulating hormone. Now once this receptor is activated, it will actually activate that G stimulatory pathway, and it will ultimately activate the transcription factors. Transcription factor. And when that transcription factor will be activated, that will act on specific genes in the nucleus of this follicular cell. And when the specific genes will be activated, there will be the synthesis of RNA, which will be mRNA. That means that will lead to the formation of mRNA, the process of transcription. Fine. And when this mRNA will be synthesized, it will go and bind on the ribosomes, which are present on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that will lead to formation of a protein. And that protein will then go to the Golgi apparatus of this follicular cell, and then there will be further modification and packaging of that protein. Now that protein we have in the form of vesicle right here. One more time. This thyroid stimulating hormone is secreted by the thyrotrope of the anterior pituitary, and this thyroid stimulating hormone, it goes and binds on the receptor. That receptor is present on the follicular cell, or we can say it activates this follicular cell, and it activates this follicular cell and this follicular cell it is involved in a formation of a protein. Now that protein is called as thyroglobulin. Now that thyroglobulin will go, and by the process of exocytosis, that thyroglobulin will be secreted out in the lumen of the thyroid follicle. Okay, now we know that the protein will be definitely made up of amino acids, right? Now this thyroglobulin is also made up of different amino acids, and one of the important amino acid which is involved actually in the formation of thyroid hormones is tyrosine. So let me make that tyrosine here. So here is one tyrosine, here is another tyrosine, here is another tyrosine, and here is another tyrosine. And there will be other amino acids also, but we have to focus on the amino acid which is called as tyrosine. So we have synthesized this protein here which is called as thyroglobulin. Okay, now we are done with the secretion of or formation of thyroglobulin. Now another important thing which is involved in the, or which is important for the synthesis of thyroid hormones is our iodine. Okay, and iodine we usually take through our diet, but in our blood that iodine is actually in the form of iodide. Okay, so we need this iodine actually to be taken here in the lumen, and then this iodine will be actually involved in the synthesis of thyroid hormones, that is T3 and T4. Now what happens is that we have to take this iodide into the follicular cell. One more time, that iodine in the blood is actually in the form of iodide. Right. Now iodide is taken into the cell through this special transporter here. Okay, but iodide concentration is actually lower outside the cell, and iodide concentration inside the cell is higher. So we need to take this iodide, or we need to do the transport of iodide again as the concentration gradient. Fine. So we have actually this iodide to be taken inside the cell, but this iodide is actually taken along with the sodium. That is, I hope you remember, that is called as the secondary active transport. So what we do is we take sodium inside the cell down the concentration gradient, but at the same time the same transported protein is taking the iodide inside the cell, inside the follicular cell. Okay, and then this iodide is taken into the lumen through this special transporter protein here, and this transporter protein is called as pendrin. And this pendrin is the transporter protein which is taking this iodide into the lumen. Okay, now once this iodide has been taken from blood into the lumen of the thyroid follicle, now there is a special enzyme there, and that enzyme is called as thyroid peroxidase. Now this thyroid peroxidase is doing so many functions in the lumen of the thyroid follicle. The first function this thyroid peroxidase is doing is called as the oxidation of iodide. Okay, it acts on this iodide and it leads to the oxidation of iodide, and this iodide is converted into iodine. Okay, it is this iodine actually which is important for the synthesis of thyroid hormones. Okay, so this process here, the conversion of this iodide into iodine, is called as the oxidation of iodide. And this oxidation of iodide is done by the enzyme which is present there, that is called as thyroid peroxidase. Now this thyroid peroxidase now takes this iodine, and then this iodine is bound to these tyrosine amino acids. Suppose we are binding one iodine here, we are binding one iodine here, we are binding one iodine here, and we are binding one iodine here. Now we are binding one iodine here, and we are binding iodine here, we are binding iodine here. Fine. Now this iodine is bound with these tyrosine again by the same enzyme that is called as thyroid peroxidase, and this process is called as iodination of tyrosine. Iodination of tyrosine. Iodination of tyrosine means that we are binding the iodine which we have taken into the lumen of lumen of the thyroid follicle, and then this iodine is actually bound with the tyrosine. Fine. Now what happens is that the next thing which is done by the thyroid peroxidase is the coupling reaction. Okay, now what happens is that it binds these two tyrosine amino acids together, and it binds these two amino acids together. Okay, now we can see here there are two iodine which are bound to this tyrosine amino acid. There are two which are bound here. There is only one which is bound here. There are two which are bound here. Right? It can be one iodine bound to tyrosine, or it can be two bound to tyrosine. When it is one, that will be called as monoiodotyrosine, and if it is two iodine bound to tyrosine, that will be called as diiodotyrosine. And after that, this thyroid peroxidase will do the coupling reaction. It will bind these tyrosine amino acids together. Okay, suppose it binds these two tyrosine amino acids together, and it binds these two tyrosine amino acids together. Now what will happen is we will have two tyrosine amino acids along with the 4 iodine. Okay, and we will have two tyrosine amino acids here along with the 3 iodine molecules here. Right? Now what will be formed there will be T3 and T4. Now T3 is actually the triiodothyronine, and T4 is thyroxine, or this thyroxine is also called as tetraiodothyronine. Okay, now here we have seen monoiodotyrosine and here is diiodotyrosine. What does that mean? Two iodine are connected to one tyrosine and one iodine is connected to one tyrosine. Now we have coupled both these together. We have bound these two tyrosine together. Now what we have got is two tyrosine amino acids with 3 iodine. And here we have 2 tyrosine amino acids with 4 iodine. So that we call as the triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine, or that is called as thyroxine. Now we are done with the coupling reaction. Now what we have to do is, now suppose we have done the coupling reaction and we have this thyroglobulin. Now it will be called as thyroglobulin colloid, and it will have these tyrosine amino acids and these tyrosine amino acids will be along with the iodine. Now what we have to do is, we have to take this T3 and T4. Now we have kind of this T3 and T4 in this thyroglobulin colloid, right? Now we have to take this T3 and T4 out of this thyroglobulin colloid so that we can secrete this T3 and T4 into the blood. Now what we have to do is, we have to cut this, we have to do that cleavage process, we have to cut these T3 and T4 out of this thyroglobulin colloid. For that, now that process is actually done inside the cell. Now what will happen is that this follicular cell will take this thyroglobulin colloid inside the cell by the process of endocytosis. By the process of endocytosis, this is taken inside the cell and put in the vesicle. Now we will have these thyroglobulin colloid, and thyroglobulin in the thyroglobulin colloid we will have this T4 and T3. Fine. Now what will happen is that this vesicle इस पे जो है ये हमारा दूसरा vesicle इस पे act करता है, and that vesicle, this vesicle is called as lysosome. Fine. This vesicle is lysosome, and we all know that lysosome has different enzymes inside, right? And what will happen is that this lysosomal vesicle, actually it will fuse with this vesicle which has the thyroglobulin colloid inside, and it will start degrading, or it will start breaking those bonds, and ultimately what we will have is this vesicle with suppose T3, and we will have T4. Fine. Now this T3 and T4, what we have to do is we have to secrete it in the bloodstream. Fine. Now what will happen is, again here this vesicle or these T3 and T4 hormones will be secreted into the blood by the process of exocytosis. Fine. And here this thyroglobulin colloid will be brought inside the cell by the process of endocytosis. Fine. And by the process of exocytosis we will have now T3 and T4. Now we have to transport these T3 and T4 into the bloodstream, and for that transportation we have a special protein which is actually transporting these T3 and T4, and that protein is called as thyroxine binding globulin. And this thyroxine binding globulin is secreted by our liver. Okay, so liver is secreting this thyroxine binding globulin, and that is secreted into the blood, and that thyroxine binding globulin is transporting this T3 and T4 hormones into the bloodstream. Okay. Now let's quickly revise what are all the steps which are involved in the synthesis of thyroid hormones T3 and T4. Okay, it started from the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus secretes TRH, that is thyrotropin releasing hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone stimulates thyrotropin and it secretes TSH, that is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone activates the follicular cell, and there is the synthesis of a protein which is called as thyroglobulin. Okay, and this thyroglobulin, by the process of exocytosis, is transported into the lumen of the thyroid follicle. Okay, and this thyroglobulin has different amino acids inside, and one of the important amino acid is our tyrosine. Fine. So that is all we have transported all this thyroglobulin into the lumen. Now, one more important thing is which is involved in the synthesis of thyroid hormones is our iodine. Okay, and that iodine is taken from the blood, but in the blood we have this iodine in the form of iodide. So the iodide is transported into the follicular cell through this transport mechanism which is called as secondary active transport. That means this iodide is transported along with this sodium. Fine. Now this iodide, once it comes inside the follicular cell, and this process actually is called as iodide trapping. Okay, so iodide trapping, transport of this iodide into the follicular cell from the blood is called as iodide trapping. Now iodide is transported into the lumen through this transporter protein which is called as pendrin. Now, this iodide, इस पे जो है हमारा एक enzyme act करता है which is called as thyroid peroxidase. Thyroid peroxidase is involved in a process called as oxidation of iodide. That means iodide is converted into iodine. And now, this iodine is taken and bound with these tyrosine amino acids again by the same enzyme which is called as thyroid peroxidase. And this binding of this iodine with the tyrosine is called as iodination of tyrosine. And then the next step is the coupling reaction. That means these tyrosine amino acids are bound together. Okay, and that is called as iodination of tyrosine. Now, if two iodine are bound with the tyrosine, that is called as diiodotyrosine. And if one iodine is bound with the tyrosine, that is called as monoiodotyrosine. Right. Now, if these two tyrosine are bound together, that will form two tyrosine along with four iodine. That means tetraiodothyronine, and if these two are bound together, that means we will have two tyrosine plus 3 iodine. That means it will become triiodothyronine. Now we will have these T3 and T4, that means triiodothyronine and tetraiodo or thyroxine. So we will have these hormones inside this thyroglobulin colloid. Right? So now we will have these T3 and T4 inside this thyroglobulin colloid. Now what we have to do is we have to cut these apart, this T3 and T4. We have to take them out of the thyroglobulin colloid so that we can secrete them into the bloodstream. Right? Now, this thyroglobulin colloid is taken inside the cell by the process of endocytosis, and on this vesicle जो है act करता है our lysosome, and it starts breaking these bonds, and ultimately we have in the vesicle this T3 and T4. Then by the process of exocytosis, this T3 and T4 are transported into the blood, out of the cell into the blood, and then in the blood there is a special transporter protein for these T3 and T4 which actually helps this T3 and T4 to circulate in the blood to different target tissues, and that protein is called as thyroxine binding globulin, which is secreted by our liver, and it is this thyroxine binding globulin which takes this T3 and T4 to different target tissues. Okay, and what are the target organs for these thyroid hormones? We will discuss in the next video. I hope it was helpful. Thank you. See you in the next class.